That's absolutely fine. I've done a couple of ads and talked about a couple of things that we've got coming up. It looks like we've got about 14 people on the call with us, which is absolutely brilliant. We are recording this call. And as mentioned earlier, the point about this workshop is to really just talk about server-side JavaScript and what it means inside Marketing Cloud. Last year, we did a survey with all our members and asked, what would you like to know more about? And scripting was a big issue. There's a lot of interest around scripting. If you look at this chart here, sort of shows the results from that survey. And server-side JavaScript, the blue bit is self-assessment at beginner, intermediate, green, and then that sort of expert was a little bit the orange there. So this appeared to be where we could really, really sort of share some knowledge and just get it out there a little bit more about what we're up to, what you can learn about and help people with their Marketing Cloud. I know I've worked with Josh a couple of times on different projects, and he's got a lot of real in-depth knowledge. Sometimes I'll think about how to do something from the UI perspective, and Josh will come back and say, then you can do this with server-side JavaScript, and here's exactly how you do it. So I guess without anything further much, I might hand this over to Josh. Throughout, if you've got any questions, probably paid just to pop them into chat. At the end, we'll wrap up with Q&A if there's any questions around that. Josh, the session's all yours.
Very good. Very good. Cool. All right, is that coming through loud and clear?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear. And right at the moment, it's on my screen, so if you want to just swap it back over to yours, we'll enjoy the presentation.
Yeah. Can do. Okie doke. All right, great, cool. Yes, so thanks for everyone for joining. It's good to see some familiar faces on the participants list, some new people and some international guests, which is cool. I noticed Tony, I think. Recognize Tony from the Email Geeks Slack channel, which is kind of cool little community. Cool. All right. So yeah, here to talk about server-side JavaScript and the where and when and how. So specifically for Salesforce Marketing Cloud. So I'm Josh, and I'm a developer. I've been a front-end developer for about 15 years or so. And then most recently sort of pivoted into doing more Marketing Cloud sort of related stuff. So for around about the last 5 years. Not really a morning person. It's nice and fresh and early over here in Melbourne, Australia. 8 o'clock in the morning for those in other time zones. But yeah, we'll see how we go. So a bit of a strange one sort of presenting to a sort of an empty room, so to speak, but I know you guys are out there, so we'll see how we go. Cool, what are we going to cover? So what is JavaScript? I think sort of pare it back a little bit to kind of giving a little bit of an overview. So it's a little bit tricky to kind of understand everyone sort of where people are at, I guess. I have to make some assumptions, I guess, as to kind of familiarity with Marketing Cloud. And the various applications and parts of Marketing Cloud. And so I'm going to have to make some assumptions around sort of, I guess, JavaScript in general, and I'm not really going to cover syntax or that sort of thing of JavaScript. So more sort of around capabilities and what is sort of JavaScript, server-side JavaScript specifically, server-side JavaScript in Marketing Cloud. When and how and where and to use, sort of pros and cons of using it, how to sort of basics, I guess, of SSJS, so covering some of the libraries that SSJS uses in Marketing Cloud, how to combine with AmpScript, testing and debugging, and finally a little bit across WSPreocupe. I know that others have covered that topic in the past, but it's related, so I may as well cover it off. And it's an exciting part of, I guess, SSJS And then finally, some examples. So what everyone's sort of here to see probably, I would guess. What I'm not going to cover is JavaScript syntax, and I'm assuming that people know something about Marketing Cloud, so we'll go from there. So what's JavaScript? JavaScript's a scripting or a programming language primarily used in client-side websites, but has been ported over to, or was created as a server-side implementation as well. So get some history behind it. So it was invented in 1995 by a guy named Brendan Eich. He worked at Netscape back in the day. Wow, it's a long time ago, so I kind of remember that. But he wrote it in 10 days, which is pretty impressive. Obviously, that was just the initial implementation or creation of that. So what's scripting language? So scripting languages don't need compiling as opposed to something like Python or Java or .NET. So the other part to that is that Microsoft, even though Netscape started and created JavaScript, they created it with the view to put into their browser to enable I guess have a scripting language that would work inside the browser. Microsoft reverse engineered JavaScript to create JScript, their own version. So that sort of kicked off a bit of that was part of sort of the browser wars of the late 90s. So if anyone remembers the old days of Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator, goodness gracious. So I'm showing my age there, but it was always a bit of a battle between those two, and they wanted to, Netscape wanted to create a standard for JavaScript, so they submitted it to ECMA so it would be kind of a standard scripting language that could be used across browsers. So they submitted that to ECMA in 1996, and the result was ECMAScript. So that is sort of, I guess, the standard for what is, I guess, the rules for what would become sort of JavaScript, or what other sort of browsers could follow to create versions of JavaScript. Internet Explorer didn't really like that too much. They wanted to do their own thing. Microsoft specifically, obviously, wanted to do their own thing, and so that sort of created a bit of the sort of part of the browser wars side of things, competing sort of products for space in the market, and that was sort of an interesting time in the world of the internet. So ECMAScript's now at edition 9, which is so they've kind of changed a lot, and Microsoft has come to the party a lot more in the last 10 or so years, and there's sort of definitely combined effort to make that standard work, and things are really progressing with the language. Okay, cool. So server-side implementation of JavaScript was implemented by Netscape soon after JavaScript created. One thing to note is that server-side JavaScript doesn't necessarily, it doesn't interact with the DOM as client-side JavaScript does. I guess to define sort of the client-side versus server-side paradigm, I guess, is client-side is the script is sort of run on a computer. So when you access a web page, you sort of it downloads the data into the browser. The browser sort of interprets that code, and evaluates JavaScript functions on your computer locally. And server side, I guess, is essentially where the code is compiled on the server, and then is passed through down to the client side, which is your local computer, and then is sort of rendered there. So the processing is done on the server as opposed to the local end user's computer. So that's just an important thing to, I guess, understand the difference there. Some of you will know that already, some of you won't, but as I'll point that out. SSJS in Marketing Cloud. So Marketing Cloud specifically used, or was ExactTarget back in the day that implemented SSJS. They implemented it to, I guess, a company, AmpScript, and it's primarily for personalization of email, landing pages, SMS, and performing operations within the platform within those areas. So similar functionality to AmpScript. There's a bit of crossover, quite a bit of crossover, in fact. Majority of things you can do with AmpScript, you can do with SSJS, but there's definitely some things that you can't. I'll cover that off later. There's also things in AmpScript you can't do that you can in SSJS. So there's definitely there is overlap, but it's not complete one for one. So SSJS support is provided through the open source project Jint, which is a JavaScript interpreter for .NET that is was, I guess, chosen at that particular point in time, ExactTarget for, I guess, its ability for that interpretation. Their reasons for doing it is sort of not all that clear, I guess. I wasn't obviously there at the time, but so Jint is an open source project. It was, I guess, from what I can gather, it was sort of implemented at a particular point in time. There were some fixes and some changes and customizations made to it to suit the ExactTarget environment. Fix security issues or any sort of other holes. Change a couple of things to make things consistent across for I guess individual instances. And I think they did some stuff like, I think they turned off some of the certain error, standard sort of errors that would have been normally thrown to help specific things for Marketing Cloud environment or ExactTarget back in the day. So it was implemented with support for ECMAScript 3. So I'm not sure if that's really sort of changed. I don't feel like it has. In sort of my readings and playing around with it, it is still set at that sort of standard level. Obviously, the language has sort of moved on. The actual open source project has sort of progressed, and now it supports ECMAScript 5, and they're working on implementing it for ECMAScript 6. It does seem to be a pretty small sort of project these days, not as popular perhaps. There's lots of other server-side JavaScript implementations such as Node and that are sort of a lot more popular, but that's sort of a different kettle of fish altogether, really. So don't really want to go into that too much, I guess. So where can you use SSJS? So you can use it in emails, SMS, script activities in automations, cloud pages, or microsites and landing pages, if those are still a thing. I can't remember. I haven't seen it in a long time. Cool. So when should it be used? I guess, so the best use is in cloud pages and script activities. That's my personal opinion. Script activities can only use SSJS, and I've got a little asterisk there because you can technically hack around that by doing little tricks where you put in your AmpScript into content blocks and use a platform function content block by ID, and so you've got your AmpScript in your little content block, and then you call it into your script activity which will execute the AMP script in there. So that's possible. It's a little bit hacky, but it's it's definitely possible. I haven't really had the need or chance to actually do that ever really, but it is it's possible. So it can be used in email, but it's not necessarily recommended for high volume sends. It can sort of SSJS has a little bit more of an overhead to it. Processes a little bit slower. So you imagine if you've got a high volume send, you're going to it's going to chew up some processing time. The more sends you have, the more time it will chew up. So it's not necessarily recommended. It is possible though. So if you're using in email SMS, it's best probably to avoid using the core library. I'll go to and explain later on what the core library is. So if you're not familiar with that, then I'll cover that off briefly a bit later. So should I be using AMP script or SSJS? And that's the classic sort of question: which tool's the right one for the job? I guess you can completely weigh up the pros and cons and make a decision based on your specific scenario and your specific circumstances, what you're trying to achieve, and all that sort of stuff. And I've got some pros and cons that I'll dive into, so it might help to, I guess, come to a decision. So pros of server-side JavaScript. It's pretty well known, obviously very popular language. So you will find that there are, lots of developers, front-end developers, full-stack developers, and even a lot of back-end developers that will know and have a familiarity with JavaScript and JavaScript syntax. So you quite possibly be able to find a developer to write some code for you that outside, I guess, of the sort of without sort of, I guess, an in-depth knowledge of Marketing Cloud. Obviously, that is valuable and is important, but it's possible to kind of rope in other people that can that understand the language. So another thing is good with SSJS is functions. So I've got acronym DRY there, so don't repeat yourself is the idea. So with functions, you can write something once and then call that function over and over again with various different contexts if you choose, to repeat a specific task multiple times, and keeps the code, I guess, concise and clean and modularized, and can sort of, I guess, stop you from sort of repeating yourself and making a whole bunch of code for no, or repeating yourself in the code. So SSJS has arrays, and as part of JavaScript has arrays and objects. So just going back, functions and some of these things are native to JavaScript itself. So arrays and objects is native to, and functions are native to the JavaScript language. AMP script doesn't necessarily have functions or the sort of concept of array or objects, really. So the other thing is JSON. So JSON is JavaScript object notation. So it's human readable text to transmit data objects consisting mostly of attribute and value pairs and array data types. There's other various data types in there. It's sort of I guess a standard that was sort of developed to make it easy to essentially transmit data in almost a for lack of a better word, cross-platform sort of way. And it became super popular, whereas when Ajax started to gain popularity, it was sort of early 2000s. So you can pass JSON. A lot of other languages also use JSON to for similar reasons for a small sort of data things, especially in API calls and things like that. And a lot of languages include parsers and things to understand JSON these days. Well, pretty much every language sort of does these days, quite standard. So within Marketing Cloud, there's specific functions as well for parsing and stringifying, which means that you're writing. So parsing is like reading JSON into a JavaScript object, and stringify is a function to convert a JavaScript object into a JSON string. So yeah, well, I think I wasn't really going to say anything else about that. Don't really want to go into too much about that. It's a different sort of, I guess it's related, but it's something probably you would need to really understand, and you probably, if you know already around APIs and things, you probably have a fair decent sort of understanding of that. So I'll leave that for now. Native functions for string manipulation. So again, some native functions to JavaScript for string manipulation, arrays and maths. You can do all sorts of crazy things. I don't really want to dive into it too much. Lots of documentation, tutorials, and all that sort of thing on JavaScript out there to go into a lot of those things. Lastly, next is WSPreocupe. So that's a new sort of piece to the scene. I guess they put it in last year. Native wrapper for SOAP API methods. So it's fast and relatively easy to use. Exception handling is a pro for SSJS. So that's something that's available to kind of handle exceptions in the code, and you get access to better error messages. I'll kind of go into that a little bit more later. So cons, so it's a steeper learning curve in AmpScript. AmpScript's pretty simple, I would suggest. The syntax is simple. There's a lot more complexity to the syntax in JavaScript, but that comes from generally more capability, I guess I would suggest. Once you've got the syntax, the basics of syntax of JavaScript, it can be pretty straightforward. So no direct SFDC, Salesforce CRM integration functions that I know of anyway. AmpScript does have that, which is cool, but SSJS doesn't. So outputting values, so personalization into emails and landing pages isn't as clean as it is for AmpScript. So it's a bit neater and a bit simpler to do in AmpScript. So your basic sort of lookup function and outputting something to a screen is pretty easier in AmpScript. Documentation can be a little bit difficult to navigate for SSJS. I think we're all aware of that. Don't need to go into that too much. The debugging can be a little bit slow and painful, but the same could be said for AmpScript to some degree. Core library adds processing overhead. I mentioned that earlier. It's not huge in my opinion, but it does exist, I think. But to what scale it is, I'm not quite sure. I can't really talk to that, unfortunately. So how to use minimum syntax for a server-side JavaScript block, much like AmpScript. You start a block which specifies the start of your server-side JavaScript, and then you close it off. So the minimum syntax is script run at equals server, and then your JavaScript in the middle, and then close off the tag at the end. So it's sort of it's a HTML tag there, or HTML-ish tag. So the full syntax to declare a server-side JavaScript is expanded, and it's very similar to AmpScript in the sense that you can change the execution type to sort of post or get. There's kind of options there, and to specify a context, and it will only run the same as that function exists in AmpScript. It'll only run given that specific context, and you can give it a context name as well. Same concept. So you can also use script blocks for AmpScript. Well, It's an interesting one. It's you can specify the language. Defaults to JavaScript, the language property there or attribute there. But the equivalent is using your %% square bracket. So, and obviously that's more familiar. I actually don't think I've ever seen the AmpScript script tag in any sort of production system. But anyway, and it makes sense, shorter and easier to remember. So the only thing to note there is that if you start with a script tag, you have to end with a script tag. You can't start with a script tag and end with a square bracket %%. So cool. How to use for personalization strings. I'll go to a few different things here. So you can essentially use the same sort of personalization string system, or it is possible to insert personalization strings as it is in AmpScript. It's not as easy. It's a little bit more complex in terms of its syntax. So you can insert a field or a specific attribute from a assertable data exception or attribute, the subscriber attribute. So you can also insert a variable, and variables that are created in AmpScript or JavaScript you can declare using that syntax control var or CTRL var. It certainly looks like control, but anyway, I think it's my dyslexia. So control eval, I'm just going to keep calling control. This is habit. You can also evaluate a script. So in this case, I'm evaluating a JavaScript snippet and outputting the result. That's kind of probably the more handy one, I guess, of the lot if you're just trying to test something out. So outputs uppercase A, B, lowercase b in this case example there. So platform object. I guess Marketing Cloud, I guess, gives access to, a set of library functions, and this comes in the form of a platform object. It's gives access to a larger AmpScript context and functionality for SSJS is provided through the platform object. I think they use the platform object. So the platform object is standard, I guess, to the to SSJS, and allows you to use certain functions to interact with Marketing Cloud. I guess it gives access to that sort of larger sort of context, so to interact with the platform itself. So that's an example here where you've got a platform object. It's using the platform object. It's very simple, sort of just a write function, so that's going to output hello world to the screen. And so core library is an external library that allows you to extend functionality further than the basic platform functionality to interact with sort of Marketing Cloud even further. It's not required. You don't necessarily need to use it, but if you want to use the functions that are in core, then you obviously need to use the to load that library. And so it was, I guess, a way for Marketing Cloud or ExactTarget to expand the platform or expand the capability of SSJS without actually modifying the sort of core code that behind it, and not break people's implementations or either applications or code in their accounts. So there's a slight performance overhead compared to using platform objects, but it's the shortest. There's benefits to it to some degree for this shorter syntax and expanded functionality, as I mentioned. There's a little bit of overlap in terms of the library, the core library and the platform library. Things like data extensions, you can kind of interact with using either. And so it does have that, like I mentioned, that slight overhead. So if you're not using core functions, then there's no point including that library because it will sort of add that overhead. Anyway, so an example here is write. So you saw the previous page, so using platform response.write, and using core, you can just write. So it's shorter, syntax, I guess. Well, in terms of you don't have to go through that platform object notation, it allows you to do lots of other things, in the platform. So AmpScript or SSJS is the ultimate sort of question. Everyone goes, well, which one should I use? So why don't we have both? Yay! You can. You can pass a variable to AmpScript from SSJS, and you can get an AmpScript variable into SSJS. So it's not officially recommended. The documentation and Marketing Cloud suggests use one or the other, but you totally can use both if you want to sort of mix and match. I've got an example here. To go back, is passing a variable into AmpScript using the function variable.setValue, and the getting an AmpScript variable is variable.getValue. I'll show you an example of that. So one thing to note, it does the functions variable.setValue and getValue need the core library to be loaded. So here's an example. So I'm setting a variable. My variable is equal to hello world outputs, and I'm outputting, passing that through or picking that up in AmpScript using the AmpScript variable. And so I'm setting another variable and comma, how are you? So then with the and then I'm doing get value sort of response. Actually, I'm writing that as well there. So hello world, how are you? So is the output there. Oh gosh, what happened? Okay, don't freak out. It's just a screenshot, but this is the feeling when you get that screenshot. Well, I do anyway. As a developer, it's pretty frustrating because a little syntax error can throw you this nice 500 internal server error, and it's pretty frustrating. But there are some things you can do to, I guess, investigate problems or issues and errors. So we'll dive into a little bit of that to some degree. So you can use a TryCatch block. You don't necessarily, I think, need the core platform for TryCatch, but I've got it on this example here. So this is an example where it I'm trying to execute a function that doesn't exist. So this function doesn't exist. I haven't declared that variable, that function. So I'm trying to run a function that doesn't exist. So that would throw an error. So what happens in that code essentially is it steps through it. If there's it goes through the try block. If there's no errors, then the catch part is ignored and it skips over that, and it keeps on processing through that code. If an error does occur, then the try execution is stopped at any point where that where that exception sort of occurs. Exception occurs, and the control, I guess, of that function flows over into the catch function or the catch part of that, and you can use the, I've got the EX as a variable there that can be used to actually do something with that error. In this case, I'm writing it to the screen just to show kind of what happens. That's fairly common. So that's the output, I guess, that you would receive from that exception. So it is more helpful. It is a little bit sort of fiddly to kind of read through that and understand it, but you can kind of get the gist of what, and most developers are used to looking through similar sort of stack dumps, I guess, for various different things. So you can see that it's thrown an exception of type, it's not all that helpful, I guess, to some degree. But you can kind of see that it's pointed out that that function, the object was expected non-existent function. And so you can kind of go, all right, well, I'll go back and look for that specific object and see what's gone wrong there. Maybe it's a typo or something like that. So you can also wrap your AMP script with a TryCatch. So there's another example of combining the two languages to provide some benefit. So you might only really have JavaScript in the this only small chunk of JavaScript in your page, and majority is AMP script. But it can help catch some errors. There, it's probably been detailed before. It's definitely a technique that's in the Elliot and Adam Spriggs's AMP script book, and detailed in various other sort of posts on the web. So what the TryCatch block won't do is catch your syntax errors. If you've typed in, if you've got malformed syntax, it won't catch that. It'll just throw a 500 at you. So that's not fun. And again, not all the error messages are useful. I've had experiences where it's sort of completely misleading, but at least something's better than nothing, right? So hopefully you can get to to your debugging. So try that first, pardon the pun. So TryCatch block, and then fall back to usual debugging methods. So, other debugging methods, commenting out chunks of your code, rubber ducking, which is the process of talking through your code and what it's supposed to be doing to an inanimate object, such as a rubber duck or a water bottle or something like that. By talking through it, get to have the chance to be able to sort of maybe pick up on something that you hadn't noticed before. Deleting sections of your code is also, to kind of eliminate or isolate the issues is another technique. And outputting variables using write functions can help to see what's going on through the process. But it's fiddly and it's not fun. But it is what it is. So. And do the best with what we've got, I guess. Allows for creative problem solving. So anyway, so WSPreocupe, so it was added in roughly the June release last year. They've sort of expanded a little bit on that over the last few releases, I think, in little ways. Allows you to access SOAP API methods. So create, retrieve, update, delete, perform, blah, blah. Translates JavaScript objects to SOAP for the purposes of passing through to the SOAP API. It's native to the platform. It's simpler to use than some of the SSJS methods. For some things it's easier, in my view. Some things it's not easier. The object reduces overhead because you don't need to use core library, and increases speed of some of your calls API. I don't know if you've tried to call and put SOAP API calls into with SSJS or AMP script before, but constructing that sort of SOAP object is kind of painful and very verbose. Simplifies the fact that you can just use a JavaScript object to essentially pass through to the interpreter or the proxy. So it's available in all non-send contexts. So your landing cloud pages and your script activities. So it also allows for impersonation, which is kind of cool. This is a really cool thing about it that I've sort of worked out, is that you can kind of essentially switch BUs or switch contexts and or users. Or I've never really actually done switched users. Haven't had a need for that. But switching BU into is something you can do quite easily. So how to use WSPreocupe. So you can construct, like I mentioned, construct a JS object that resembles SOAP objects. That can be a little bit tricky sometimes because understanding the exact sort of structure of a SOAP object is a little bit challenging because reading through some of the SOAP documentation is also not fun. But you're writing JavaScript and not XML. Yay! So that's good, and you don't have to concat all these sort of nasty, SOAP sort of things, strings together, or convoluted sort of function calls to create and structure objects. There's examples out there. Elliot wrote a really cool article last year, sort of gave a very simple demonstration of calling a triggered send, and it's something like 25 lines for calling a triggered send, lines of code that is, and very same for just standard SSJS using core functions, but you can use WSPreocupe and do the same thing in maybe 10 lines of code or less, even if you kind of squash things together. So that's kind of cool. So it returns usual SOAP object response as a JavaScript object, so that contains a status and result data. So you can then use that to, in your JS. You don't have to sort of parse any XML response data or anything like that, or you need, you get the result data sort of be able to loop over or whatever you got there. That was possible sort of to do with core functions, but anyway, it's nice and neat and easy with WSPreocupe. So I'll get a quick example here. So to initialize, you use you can create a new script util object function and attach that to a variable. And in this case, this is an example just gleaned from the documentation. All it's doing is updating a data extension using the object ID, so it's updating the name of a specific data extension. In this case, it's calling it renamed DE. So it can be a little bit, like I mentioned, it can be a little bit difficult to navigate some of the documentation on this feature. Is not super well. It has room for improvement. I don't know, is probably how we should say it. And to try and do something sometimes requires a lot of trial and error to make sure that you've got the correct structure of your the SOAP to represent that SOAP object. Can be a little bit fiddly sometimes. Cool. All right. So examples. All right. So right. Now I'll switch over to hopefully that's sort of coming through. And I will sort of zoom in a little bit just to kind of run through some examples really quick. This is using the platform, the core library in this, specifically because I'm using the right shorthand. And this data extension function as well. So you can initiate a data extension. This code essentially will write to a data extension. So I'm getting some data from a form field. So maybe it's been a form submission on one, a form submission, and I'm getting the values from that form submission into my sort of data object here. You can obviously hard code those elements if you choose, that sort of stuff, if you want to. And then the call is to add rows essentially to that data extension. And writing out the result. I think the result essentially is just a number at that point of numbers of rows added, I believe. You can add multiple rows, I believe, in the same call using an array. Triggered send. Okay, so I see your note, but I'm just going to keep plugging away. I don't know if people have sort of questions while I'm going, then Matt, I don't know if you want to sort of chip in at certain points, but I guess we can address questions at the end, but Matt, so maybe I'll just keep plowing ahead. So there's an example of using the WS proxy for a trigger send, very similar to the example I mentioned earlier. You are able to construct this object for the triggered send definition by passing the subscriber details, and that will sort of trigger off a triggered send, sending that email to that specific email address. Is this? Let me just see if there's a problem here. Is there a problem? Oh, okay, I see some notes. Yes, yeah, thanks, Chris. So yes, there's a limitation to some of those through the WS proxy. You're right. So you can only really retrieve, maximum of 2,500. You can sort of do chain. I guess calls and continue the function to kind of keep retrieving more information. It's not something really I've done a lot of, or had the need to do a lot of, but it's possible to do that. Cool. So logout sub event. Many of you might have done this with AmpScript. It is, I guess a way of sort of unsubbing someone and actually attaching a reason to it. And I guess for tracking purposes, you can kind of associate that and subscribe to a specific thing. Most of you kind of know about that already. This is an example where I've got some multiple business units with multiple different mids. This is perhaps something you could be used, I guess, in a preference header type sort of scenario, where I've got an array of business units or business unit names that they've opted out of. This is a particular scenario. It's not going to suit all, but this is just an example. So then I'm checking to make sure I've got some values in that array, looping over that array, and then switching business unit context. So I have a set of mids up here that relate to the business units. And so by calling the set client ID and passing in the mid, I can sort of switch context. So I'm going to now then call the logon sub event within that business unit's context. So that's kind of the idea. So I've got to create some properties there, and I'm executing that logon sub event there, displaying just some output, just to kind of see what's happening there based on the response. And then finally, once I'm outside that, once I've finished with that step, I reset the client IDs back to the standard or the normal context of where that cloud page exists. It's not completely necessary, but as far as I know, because I don't think it sort of extends beyond the context of that particular page load. So anyway, so all subs status. So this is a one where you essentially I'm retrieving a bunch of statuses in all subs across multiple business units. So again, using WS Proxy, and I've got quite a few WS Proxy, a few proxy examples, but it's kind of cool, and it's been sort of one of the things I've been playing around a lot more with lately, because it's kind of new and fun and shiny and interesting. So this sort of example here allows you to sort of get the status, or a person's status, so it returns the status and then the specific mid. So this could be executed at a parent level, and it will sort of search all through the child accounts to get the status on all subscribers through the child accounts. I never really worked out how to, or had a chance to sort of do that with any other way, but it's kind of something I've worked out before. So another example is webhook. I guess one thing I've come across in the past is like, well, I want to create a web page to receive some data based on a webhook. Or, an example sort of in the past was something like a Shopify site that needs to sort of trigger someone into a journey or something like that. And when someone makes a purchase, it's got webhooks, and doing a post to this example web page, getting that sort of post payload is a little bit of a challenge. This function here will allow you to get the post data in that call, from that call. So if you can imagine, so I've got an example here that that JSON object sort of would look like that, with a first name and last name. I'm getting that value using that function. The get post data function is not one that's documented. It's sort of it is available, but it's not one of those ones that's not documented. There are a few functions that aren't documented. I don't know why, for whatever reason. But it's sort of out there on Stack Overflow and stuff like that. So cool. So then, yeah, I'm getting the data from that post payload, and then outputting that to screen. Obviously, you can do anything you want with it at that point. So quickly, just I don't want to take too much more of people's time. I'll just wrap up, I guess. Make sure there's some time for questions. So this is an example, and I think I'll stop it at this point. I will post examples like on GitHub, my GitHub and stuff like that. I haven't really done that. I'm kind of lazy like that, but I'll do that later on. This is an example where I'm using the REST API to get the HTML content of a specific email, and then outputting that to the screen and replacing some the personalization strings essentially in that email with certain variables. It's not particularly a full example. I probably need to sort of flesh that out a little bit, but I guess one of the main examples is that, and demonstrating the fact that you can use sort of the Marketing Cloud REST API in a cloud page type sort of example, or even the script activity. Also got examples in here about how to create an automation and also how to start an automation. I don't think I've got enough time to kind of really drill into those, but again, I'll post them and we'll make them available. Some of them are sort of ones that are available on documentation, etc. But yeah, so all right, let's wrap it up. I think I just want to say thanks to the developer group for the opportunity, and people like Matt Cameron, Elliot, and Adam Springs, who I've never met Adam, but I mean, let's still have learned a lot from him. He contributes a lot to the community, which is awesome. The Link Digital crew, big ups and shout outs to those guys. Love those guys. And if you've enjoyed the presentation, I hope you consider coming to a meetup and contributing in any way that you feel comfortable or able to. Hit me up on the Slack channel for the developer group if you want to chat or whatever about anything. And I think that's about it from me. So
thanks,
Matt,
Josh.
if we have questions, or,
no, absolutely.
I know I'm conscious of time. I've kind of waffled on for a bit, but yeah.
No, it's absolutely brilliant what you've done. A lot of it's so awesome, and I've got so many things out of what you've been talking about. It's just been amazing. As Josh said, and I'm so conscious of time too, we've sort of run over and we've got a couple of minutes to the hour. Salesforce Stack Exchange, go there with questions. That's a great resource. If you need to dig deeper, join us on Slack. And if you need an invite to the Slack group and you're not sure how to get one, hello@sfmcdg.org. Just send an email to that and we'll organise an invite into the group. It's about 100 developers in there, 101 as of this morning. We've got a bit of a back channel there where you can sort of dig deep on questions. So if there's anything more you want to do with this, we'll also get, with the Serverside JavaScript, we'll also get this up onto our GitHub page. So as soon as you get something published, Josh, we'll get you sort of tied in with the GitHub page, which is github.com/Salesforce Marketing Cloud Dev Group. Thanks everyone for joining. I know we've sort of run out of time for questions. We can continue on. If anyone wants to do with questions, how are you placed, Josh, to cover a couple of questions off?
Yeah, I'm okay, as long as everyone else is okay to hang around. People feel free to drop off if they want to.
All right, I'll unmute all, and if there's any questions or comments there, please feel free.
It's on now.
Everyone's unmuted.
Okay.
And
So